Today is what effects did post-war tensions have on America's founding ideals? I'm going to cover sections 1 through 4 here with this video. Section 1, you guys read introduction-wise, looking at the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Background-wise, both of these guys have Italian heritage. Sacco worked for a construction company as a water boy and a pick and shoveler, made $1.15 a day, long days, does study English, eventually becomes a shoemaker, and finds some financial success. Vanzetti, on the other hand, harder life than Sacco, never really finds much success economically. And so these two are going to become targets that many people are going to say of the judicial system not getting a clear case. And we'll be looking more at that here throughout the chapter. So section 2 is looking at the emerging economic tensions coming out of World War I. Again, World War I created great economic prosperity in the United States. Business was good. Now, what we have is what's called demobilization. Demobilization is this transition from wartime to peacetime, and the government really did not put together any good plans for that shift from this wartime industry to peacetime, consumer time industry. And so the federal government cancels many of these wartime contracts with industries that they had agreed to pay money to continue producing goods for the war effort. And so a lot of these businesses are going to end up having to close their doors. On top of that, you have the Army discharging nearly 4 million veterans. These vets, basically one-way ticket home, no sort of really much financial educational support like we have with troops today. And they're going to flood now the labor market as well, having to, theoretically try to get their jobs back. So now we start to have, again, a large labor pool out there. America during World War I is saving their money. Again, businesses were asked to switch from consumer goods to wartime goods, and so people had saved their money. And so right out of World War I, there's a spending spree. Business is going to respond with this spending spree. They realize that Americans have money, and they're going to start to see inflated prices. The prices of goods are going to go up, and as a result, the value of that dollar shrank significantly. So Americans paying 2 times as much for essential goods than what they did back in 1913. And so with this high inflation, we start to see this recession creeping in, this decline in economic activity and prosperity. And from 1920 to 1921, 100,000 businesses, again, will have to close their doors. Farmers feeling the pinch. 453,000 farmers will be foreclosed on, losing their land. So the effects of the recession, again, coming out of this post-World War I era, factories closing their doors, millions of Americans, 5 million unemployed. That standard of living is decreasing due to inflation. Those rising prices are now lowering the standard of living. And, as we've been talking here, the economy is lapping into this recession. And so during this time period, there is a high amount of crime that's taking place. And the South Braintree robbery really is nothing all that out of the ordinary. This was actually a back page newspaper story when it initially happened. It received little attention in the media. It's a crime that took a minute, didn't draw a lot of attention, but again, it was more having to do with who the targets were and some of the questionable credibility of the cases that will eventually become a big deal, and many people saying that these two are pinned with this crime because of some of their cultural and political background rather than actually being responsible for the crime. Section 3 looks at the rising labor tensions then, causes of some of these labor tensions post-World War I. That National War Labor Board, which was created during World War I, is no longer involved in labor relations. So that struggle between business and labor picks back up again. Corporations trying to fight unionization. They're looking to reduce wages, push longer working hours, and again, worker safety is not necessarily a concern. So similar to what we saw with American industrialism in the late 1800s. So effects wise, many Americans actually during World War I did join unions for the first time, and the two big ones at this point in time are the American Federation of Labor. They focus on bread and butter unionism, meaning a couple of key issues: better pay, better working conditions, shorter hours, keeping their targets minimal. The industrial workers of the world, those were the Wobblies. They were socialists, again, looking to change the status quo socially and economically in America. So during 1919, when the economy is struggling, you see 3,600 strikes nationwide. That is the most amount of strikes in a year in American history. 1 out of every 10 Americans will walk off the job during this time period with issues with regards to pay, hours, things as such. The 2 big ones the textbook's going to talk about is the Seattle General Strike. 35,000 shipyard workers initially start this strike, but in a sign of solidarity, 100,000 other workers in Seattle join in. The city of Seattle basically goes silent for several days. Federal troops ordered in to break the strike, much like we saw again during American industrialism. The Boston police force, they as well go on strike. Their pay is being cut, wages are being cut, and refusing to negotiate with the police union. For several days, the city of Boston lacks police, and eventually the city lapses into anarchy without law and order in place. And again, you see the government called in. Coolidge, future president, Calvin Coolidge, calls in the National Guard to resolve the conflict with the Boston police. Those individuals will not rejoin the force. So unions are going to lose public support and membership because of the events taking place. Union membership begins to decline and will continue for many decades from this point on. And reasons, this fear that this radical union activity could lead to an anarchy. The notion that being a union member means you are a radical anarchist is oftentimes associated. Many of the strikes really fail to achieve their goals, and the exclusive politics of unions. The AFL is a great example, really limited who could be a member, so no unskilled labor, women, African American, immigrants, these minority groups are limited, so you're not getting a big of net then with the AFL. On top of that, the Supreme Court diminished the power of unions. They're going to restrict the right to boycott a business, fighting unionization. They declared unconstitutional child labor laws, and they're going to reject a minimum wage for women. So now, as a result, it becomes easier for industry to hire low-pay earners such as women and children, again, giving more power to big business and limiting the rights of the worker. Section 4 then kind of goes hand in hand with Section 3. We start to look at some of the growing political tensions in terms of Sacco and Vanzetti. They were anarchist members. They, at the night of the arrest, were both carrying guns. They had weapons on them, and the Sacco had a pamphlet ad for an anarchist rally that Vanzetti was a scheduled speaker. So they are definitely anarchist members, believers, and supporters of it. And so again, post-trial, many people feel that the conviction, it had a lot to do with some of their radical political views at a time where, again, to think outside the box or a little bit differently was viewed as dangerous in America. Now, why were anarchists becoming targets? You have a slew of bomb scares that are taking place during this time period. April 1919, authorities discovered 36 bombs, a lot of these targeted at big business, capitalist, political giants that sided with industry, and many Americans saw the bomb scares this sign of radicalism, this favoring extreme change, this wanting the shift from democracy to socialism and the fear of communism in this country. So the different groups that Americans fear, socialist, communists, anarchist. Ever since the Russian Revolution, communism was on the rise. Many people were afraid that Russians were infiltrating stateside and looking to create a communist nation here in the United States. And so this post-war fear of radicals becomes known as the Red Scare. This is the first Red Scare in America. This fear that these Bolshevik Reds coming from Russia are spreading anarchy to theoretically undermine democracy. We will look at the second Red Scare when we get to our Cold War unit. Red Scare leads to raids on subversives. June 2nd, 1919, the scare intensifies. Why? 8 bombs go off simultaneously in 8 different cities, one of the targets being a high-ranking official, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. Palmer then launches a campaign against subversives. Subversives are individuals looking to overthrow the government. And so this campaign is referred to as the Palmer Raids. Palmer will send government officials to raid homes, businesses, meeting places of possible subversives. They're looking to find weapons, evidence of violent material against individuals that, again, are deemed dangerous to America. We're looking at no search warrants, so police breaking into homes and businesses without those warrants, and then really finding little or no cause to support the raids that were taking place. Over 6,000 Americans are arrested. You see many foreign-born suspects being deported. And again, no evidence of any sort of violent activity is found with any of these raids. And this picture does a pretty solid job at looking at how thorough these guys were when they would basically enter a home, again, with no search warrants. And so civil liberties, coming back to the suffering of civil liberties, anytime there's fear, oftentimes you see personal rights being taken away. Fear of radicalism overshadowed concerns about abuses of civil liberties. You have sedition laws being passed in 30 states, limiting what you can and can't say about the government, books being removed with fear that they send bad messages, and then socialists becoming targets of mob violence. Palmer, he had hoped to ride a wave into the White House. He declared that there was an announced plot to overthrow the government in New York City on May 1st, 1920. Nothing happened, and this really shatters Palmer's record and limits his ability to run for office. And as you can see in this political cartoon, Palmer fearing seeing reds anywhere he went. So, all right, guys, thanks for your attention. We'll have another video for you in the future with the last couple sections of chapter 25. Thanks.